Welcome to this optional video. This video is meant for everybody who just joined this expert track. So in case you followed along the course so far and watched the previous module, you can skip this video. In case you just joined, let me guide you quickly through the current project status and what we achieved so far. Now, before we dive into the page, you can of course find the project code attached to this video to get started quickly. However, as you can see right here, we created 𝗧host so far. This is our hosting provider website, and we basically built this starting page right here. We added a background image, for example. We have a navigation bar, and down here we have our different plans. Then we also got some features down here, and we have a footer. The footer and the navigation bar is the same on all pages. So we also have a packages page, which gives you an overview of the different hosting plans we have available on our fictional site. And down here we have our footer again. And we also have a customers page with some nice images and some testimonials in the end. And down here we again have the footer. And we also added a form right here if we click onto this Start Hosting button. The important thing is that our site focuses onto CSS, of course. Therefore, we did not create any backend, and we won't create any backend because the focus of this course is to learn how to use CSS. But we already implemented a mobile design. So if we click right here in the developer tools, we can see, if I increase the zoom a bit like that our page also works in a mobile view. We can, for example, change or switch to different pages. This is the packages page again. You can see it works quite nice in the mobile view also. And if we click onto our icon right here, we are coming back to our starting page, also in a nice mobile design. So this is what our website looks like at the moment. Let's now also have a quick look at the code we wrote so far. Because right there we have a main index.html file, which contains, of course, the navigation bar and the footer, and also the content of this starting page. For example, our different plans right here. Choose your plan. We saw that right here, this part. Then we have a corresponding CSS file, which refers to this index.html file. Then we have a shared CSS file, which contains the CSS styles for our header and for the footer. So basically for the elements which are displayed on every website. We also have some shared JS file here, so some JavaScript, which is required to make sure that our choose plan button right here, this one works, and which opens that modal right here. And for the other pages, we have our customers file right here. So this is for this customers page we can see with the corresponding CSS and HTML files. The same thing is true for packages and for start hosting. And then we got this image folder, which basically contains the customer images, our background image of the starting page, and the background image of our plans right here on this page, and of course also our 𝗧host icon right there. And that's it actually. This is what we achieved so far, and with that we can now dive into Flexbox together. Welcome to this module. So we finished the actual styling of our website. We have a responsive design which works quite well. So actually we are done. Well, yes and no. We could keep the page it is in the current status. The general functionality is fine, but there are more things to be added. And one of these things is Flexbox, because as you can see right here, it's the modern way to change the way our elements are displayed. So it's basically another value for the display property, but a really special value which allows us to add a lot more, well, flexibility to our elements. So what will we learn in this module then? Well, we will have a look at the flex container. This is basically the element the display flex declaration, so the special Flexbox property, you could say, will be applied to. In addition to that, we'll have a look at the difference between the main axis and the cross axis, a specific concept we need to understand to, well, understand Flexbox. And we'll have a look at the flex items. These are basically the items inside our flex container. We'll of course also dive into the different properties we have and have a look at all the core functionalities of Flexbox. So that's what's inside this module. Let's now have a look at our project and see where we have certain areas that could be improved. So that's our website basically, and we have a nice design, we have a responsive design, and that's implemented for all our pages right here. So you could say, well, this is fine, why would we change that? Well, the reason is that if we go to our code and right here into the shared CSS file, for example, we have code in there which is not perfect, as I would say, or which can be improved. Because if we go to our main header, for example, right here, then specifically have a look at this display inline block part. This is something we could change with Flexbox, because inline block is a nice way to, well, change the position of elements, but Flexbox can make things like that easier. Now you could say, why would I change that? This looks fine, and I would agree. But if we go down to the navigation, for example, right here to our main navigation, right there, where we have our calculation in here with the pixels in it, well, I'm not sure if that's the best way to create your website, because wouldn't it be great to make sure our navigation items, so these items right here, are aligned the way they are right now, but without having this strange calculation right there, which is not nice to change, and which definitely is also not the best way to write our code right here. The same thing is true for the main CSS and the customer CSS file. For example, if we scroll down right here to testimonial info, we have the display inline block repeated right here and right there, and that's also part of the code that I would like to get rid of. We will not have a look at the start hosting file, the CSS file, because Max will show you how to change this with the so-called grid in the next module. So this is not something we'll focus on to now. So our goal basically is to make the code right here leaner or better in the shared CSS file, for example, this one, and also get rid of all our display inline block declarations or properties like this one right here that we have. So that's the current situation of our website basically. We also have, for example, right here, some minor issues where we can see that the free plans are aligned vertically, that's working. But as you can see, this right premium plan right here is a little bit smaller than the free plan. So I would also like to have these plans on the same level. So these are all the small things I would like to change. I would like to get rid of the display inline block declaration. I would like to make sure that small issues like these are changed. And therefore, I would like to show you what Flexbox is, how it works, and how we can use it to make our code leaner and more efficient in the end and better to read and interpret. Therefore, what we have to do right now is we have to understand what Flexbox actually is. Now let's have a look at that in the next lecture. So what is Flexbox actually? Well, as I said, Flexbox allows us to change the way our elements are displayed. And using Flexbox is actually quite simple, because to use Flexbox, we simply have to add a specific property to our element. To which element? We'll dive into that in a few seconds. This property we need is the display property. We talked about that property throughout the course already. It's that display block, inline or inline block thing where we can change, well, the behavior of our elements. And if we now use the display property in connection with this value right here, the flex value, well, then we create the following. We create a flex container. And that's the first important thing we have to understand. If we apply display flex to an element, this element will be turned into a so-called flex container. Now, as the name indicates, a container has to, well, contain things, and that's exactly what happens right here. Because inside our flex container, we should have other nested elements. And these elements are the so-called, well, children. And these children are also named flex items. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. We have an element, normally a parent element, with the display flex declaration. This parent will become the so-called flex container after we applied this declaration. And all elements inside this container are children of the parent, of course, and at the same time flex items. Now that's the first step. The second step is that once we turned our elements into such a Flexbox construct, as I would call it, we can apply different properties to both our parent, our flex container, and our children, our flex items. For the parent, we can apply the flex flow property, the justify content property, the align content property, and the align items property. We'll of course dive into all these properties throughout this module. The same thing is true for our flex items. For these, we can also apply properties. The properties right here we have are order, flex, and align self. We'll also dive into these throughout the course. The problem now is that this is a very abstract construct now for you, and at the moment it's probably not clear how we can use the combination of this flex container and this flex items and these properties to change the way our elements are displayed. Therefore, we will forget about the flex items for the first part of this module and really focus onto the actual flex container and the corresponding properties. Because with that, you will quickly understand the core concept of Flexbox, and then we will be able to dive deeper into the flex items. And how can we dive into these concepts? Well, we will of course also apply Flexbox to our project, but actually I think that understanding all these things in a theoretical and linear project is the better approach. Therefore, let's have a look at our theory project and do our first steps with Flexbox in there in the next lecture. So this is our theory project, which will guide us through this module. As you can see, it's basically a quite simple project. We have our div right here, the div with the class flex container. That's what I just showed you on the slide. This is basically this wrapping element. And inside this container, we have 6 different divs. Each div has an own class, so from item 1 to item 6. So we basically have 6 so-called flex items in the end. And each item has a different content. This is simply a div. This has a width of 250 pixels. As you can see, I'm using box sizing border box, so we have 250 pixels right here as the entire width of the element. And then we have an item with a height of 250 pixels. Then we have an item with a width and a height of 300 pixels. And we have 2 items with an equal width of 350 pixels. You will see throughout this module why this information is important, therefore I added it right here. If we have a look at our code, you can of course find the same code right here in the index.html file. And we have a CSS file which has some basic styling applied. As I said, we have border box, for example. We have some background color for the HTML and for the body elements. And then we have the flex container and our different flex items. Now, the great thing is for the moment that the first part of this module will solely focus onto this flex container right here, because that's, as you saw, the first core concept of Flexbox. We will create a so-called flex container and then apply different properties to it. Now, the code to this can of course be found attached to this video, so make sure to use this code to get started right now with our Flexbox project. So what does it take now to create such a flex container? Well, as you also saw on the slide, we simply have to add our display property, once again, this one right here, and now we will simply write display flex, like that. If we now save that and go back to our page and not reload it, but now have a look at the default behavior we have, so this is the normal behavior we see for block level elements. As you can see, we can change the size or the width, and it will decrease the width until it hits the defined width right here. And that's actually everything we know so far, so no surprises right here. If we now reload the page, we can see a lot of interesting things. The first thing and the most obvious one is that our elements are now displayed well in one row, so not according to the typical block level element behavior that we saw so far. And we also see that the elements, except for the third one, use the entire height available in the parent element. The height is then actually defined by this third element right here, as you can see with the 300 pixels height, and all the other elements follow this value, because we didn't define a height for the rest, except for this third item right here, so this only has a height of 250 pixels. Another thing we see is that if we decrease the width right here, we can see that the width of the elements decreases, as you can see, up to here, up to the point where the content, this one right here, or that one, needs the space inside the element. If we increase the width, we can see that the parent element increases and basically behaves like a normal block level element. So that's the first thing we did, and very important, with applying display flex, we also turned our flex container class right here into such. So this is now a flex container, and all the items inside this container, so these 6 items, are now flex items. This automatically happened just because we added display flex to the parent. Now, let's go back and let's see if we have another value, because we do. We also have inline flex. This one right here, not inline block, but inline flex. If we apply that and reload the page, you can immediately see what happens right now. Because in contrast to the display flex declaration, we now, well, basically cannot change the size of our elements, because the size is now simply predefined by the actual width that was defined. And also the parent element doesn't change its size anymore, it just uses the space that is required to display all the content. So basically it behaves like an inline element. What is still interesting though is that the height, this one right here, is still used according to the definition of the 4th item right here. We'll dive deeper into the reasons for that later throughout this module. But the important thing to keep in mind for now is that we basically can apply display flex or display inline flex to our parent element. This will then become the flex container, and the elements inside this flex container will become the flex items. However, let's change back the value to flex for now, because we will probably use that throughout this module. So if we reload now, we can see that the block level behavior is back again. And in the next lecture, we'll now have a look at 2 additional properties, because by applying display flex or display inline flex, we automatically apply these 2 additional properties. So which properties did we apply automatically? Well, we applied 2 properties. The first one is flex direction. That's the first property we had, and the default value for this property is row. The second property we applied is flex wrap. This one right here, with an initial value of no wrap. That's basically what happened automatically just by applying display flex right here. If we now go back to our page and reload it, we can see that nothing changes, of course, because as I said, this is basically the default behavior that we saw. But if we now change no wrap right here to wrap, like that, and again reload our page, then apparently nothing changed. But if we now decrease the size, can you see it? Actually, you can see 2 interesting things, by the way, because the first thing is, as soon as the element would have to reduce its width below the defined value, so in this case 350 pixels for example, the element is wrapped and, well, jumps into the second row. The second interesting thing is that the height of the element also changed now, because in the first row it simply adapted to the height we had defined right here. So this was the maximum height, therefore all the other elements adapted to that. Now that the element is in a second row or in a new row, it doesn't behave like that anymore and simply uses the, well, height it needs to simply display the content. If we reduce that more or further, you can see that all elements are wrapped one after another, like that, and in the end we have displayed it all like this in one column. If you would further decrease it, you could see that the behavior again follows the one we saw in the beginning, that the width would be reduced up to the point where the space is needed by the actual content. So that's the first value we changed right here. We changed flex wrap to wrap. We also have another value called wrap reverse, by the way. So if we would do this now and reload the page, like that, then you can see that the order simply was mixed up. Now the div, so the first item right here, is at the bottom and the item 6 is at the top. And if I now increase the width again, you can see that the behavior would turn back to the behavior we had in the beginning. But that's important. The height, as you can see it right here, is now not, well, displayed from the top to the bottom, but now it starts right here and simply uses the height as it is defined right here for 250 pixels up to this point. So that's what we can change with this flex wrap property. It basically defines, well, if our items should wrap and how they should wrap. But let's keep it to wrap maybe, because I think that's the more, well, expected value you would have when using such a wrap right here, like that. However, what about flex direction? That's also a really interesting value, because if we change this from row to column right here, like that, just column, and now reload the page, well, then you can see a lot of changes. Because actually, our elements now behave the way we would our block level elements expect to behave. We have the div right here, for example, which has no width specified, so it simply uses the entire space available right here. The same thing is true for the third div right here. But our other divs, of course, which have a specified width, only are displayed up to the point that is defined by this width. So right here, for example, 250 pixels. If I now decrease the width, can you see it? The elements are not displayed below that value. However, the other elements, for example this one right here, which don't have any width defined, now reduce the size even below the point that is actually required by the content, as you can see it right here. So we can reduce it up to a minimum right there. So that's what we can change with the flag's direction right here. We also have column reverse, for example, partially kind of the way we saw it for the flag's wrap. If I now reload right here, you can see that the items are now displayed from the bottom right here to the top, but in the reverse order. Now, as you can imagine, if we have column reverse, we also have row reverse right here, like that. And if I now go back and reload this one, then, as you can probably imagine, we can see that the div starts right here, so the first item, and the last item is displayed to the left. If I decrease the width right here, then you can see it also follows this wrapping behavior, so that in the end, this is the last item in the row, which will be displayed on top then, because it wraps from left to right, basically. Now, let's go back to row right here, though, and let's keep the flags wrap to wrap. And now you're probably partially confused, because this was a lot of flags direction, of row and column and reverse, and of flags wrap and no wrap. So I think it's now time to dive back into some theory, because with this flags direction, we have an important impact onto a core concept behind Flagsbox. And that's the definition of the main axis and the cross axis. Now, let's find out more about these in the next lecture. So what happened here? What did we do by applying flags direction to our parent element, to our flags container? And what does this have to do with the main axis and the cross axis? Well, this is our starting point, right? We had our flags container and we applied the flags direction property with a value of row. Now what happened then is, basically, this is the default value as I said, is that our starting point for the main axis is the left top corner of our element, basically, or of our website. Now, if the main axis goes from the top left to the top right, well, then the cross axis, which, that's important, always has the same starting point as the main axis, goes from the top left to the bottom left corner, of course. So that's basically the default behavior, how our flags items are displayed then. They are displayed in a row, so along the main axis, and from left to right. Now, in addition to row, we also applied another value. We applied flags direction row reverse. Well, and if we think about the way row behaves, so from the top left to the top right for the main axis, then row reverse simply behaves the other way around. It starts in the right top corner and goes to the left top corner, and the cross axis starts also in the right top corner. As I said, they always have the same starting point, and goes to the right bottom corner. That's actually the first thing we have to understand about these two axes. We have a main axis and a cross axis, and depending on the value we apply to the flags direction property, the starting point and the finishing point of these two axes changes. Now let's go back to the code and play around with that a bit to really get a better feeling for it. Because right here we have our flags direction, which is still row, and the flags wrap is set to wrap, which is totally fine. Now, in our code, if we increase the size and reload it, so what we can see right here is that the first flags item, so this one right here, starts in the top left corner. You will see in a few seconds why this is the top left corner. And the flags direction is row, so it goes from the left to the right here. So this is the main axis now. And if we now reduce the size so that the wrap takes place, it simply wraps along the cross axis, so from the top to the bottom. But as we can see, the first flex item is still on the top and still part of the top left corner right here. Now let's increase the width, and let's now change the flex direction from row to row reverse. With that, if we go back and reload the page, we can see that the behavior changed because the way our main axis and cross axis are defined also changed. Because now the starting point for both axes is the top right corner of our flex container. But if I now reduce the width, as you can see it right here, the first flex item stays on top because keep in mind the starting point is still the top right corner. But all the other elements are then aligned along the cross axis, so from top to bottom right there. So that's what we have to understand now basically. With this flex direction, we can have an impact onto this main and cross axis. And this is only flex direction row and row reverse. But we also had flex direction column and column reverse. Now let's go back to the slide and have a look at the theoretical concept behind these now. Because what happened now if we again take our flex container and now apply flex direction column? Well then, and that's also another important thing, the starting point is exactly the same that we had before for flex direction row. It's still the top left corner. But now the main axis, as you can see, goes from top to bottom, and the cross axis goes from left to right. And that's really crucial to understand because we will need that concept throughout this module. The flex direction basically defines if our main axis is the row, so from left to right or right to left with row reverse, or if the main axis is from top to bottom, or that's the second thing we can see right now, if we add flex direction column reverse, or from bottom to top, starting from the left lower corner. So that's the tricky thing right here maybe, but it's actually quite easy to remember. If the flex direction is row, then the starting point is the top left corner and the row defines the main axis. With row reverse, the starting point is the right top corner and the main axis is of course the row. If the flex direction is column, then the starting point is again the top left corner, but the main axis now goes, well, as the direction indicates, along the column. And if we have column reverse, then the starting point is the bottom left corner and the main axis is again the column. Now let's also have a look at that in our, well, practical example now. Because right here, if we go to our flex container and now change the flex direction from row reverse to column, like that, and reload our page right here, you can see exactly what we just saw on the slide. The main axis now starts in the top left corner, and the items are aligned along the main axis. But that's important, the main axis now goes from top to bottom. If I would go back now and change it to column reverse, like that, and reload the page again, then the starting point is the bottom left corner right here. And as we can see, the items are again aligned along our main axis, which is now this one right here. So with that, we saw the core concept behind flex direction. It allows you to, well, define the way our elements are displayed, and really important, to also specify the main and the cross axis. And the main and cross axis is a really important concept that we need to understand now because it has an impact onto other properties we can use. If we, for example, go back right here and change our flex direction to row again, like that, and now go back and reload the page, we could already see that if I increase the width, that the elements, so the height of the elements, simply adjust to the largest element, so the one with the largest height, you could say. And well, so far we simply accepted this behavior. But the thing is that we can change this behavior, so also the height and the default behavior our elements have right here. For that, we need additional properties and we need to understand the concept of main versus cross axis. Well, the latter one is something we understood now, but now it's time to have a look at these other properties we could apply now. Before we dive into this property I just talked about, I just wanted to add some information to flex direction and flex rep. Because you could also write these two properties in a shorthand. And this shorthand is called flex flow and would then be defined like this, so row and rep. This would basically be the shorthand for flex direction, the row, and flex rep, the rep. I will just stick to the separate properties because I think it's easier to read and better to learn. However, which property am I referring to now to ensure that this behavior, so that the height will always follow the maximum height defined right here? Well, this property is align items, like that. And the default value for align items is stretch, this one right here. If we apply that and reload the page, you can see nothing changes. We simply have the same behavior that we had before. If I change this value now to center, like that, and reload the page again, then you can see that the height suddenly changed, because with this align items property right here, we can have an impact onto the height of our elements. And this is totally wrong. I'm just saying that because this is what you could think right here once you see that. But if we now apply our knowledge, and this knowledge was that if we change the flex direction from row to column, that this means the main axis also changes. So let's add column right here, like that, and reload the page. Then you can see that it didn't really impact the height. It simply centered our flex items along the cross axis. That's really important because our cross axis, right now we have flex direction column. So this means our cross axis goes from left right here to the right. And as you can see right here in the center, we now, well, centered our items. If I change it back to row now, right here, like that, and reload the page, we centered our items along the cross axis, which is now from the top left corner to the bottom left corner. Now, let me change it back to column though, because I want to show you something else. Because if we apply another value for our align items property right here, for example, flex start, this one, then you can see that if I reload that, the items are now centered at the beginning, well, flex start, of our cross axis. Again, the cross axis now is from top left to the top right. We could also use flex enter, for example, like this. And if we reload the page now, you can see the items are now centered along the cross axis, but at the end of it. If I would change the flex direction back to row, like this right here, and reload the page, then it is centered, as you can see, at the end of the cross axis, which now again goes from the top left corner to the bottom left corner. And what you can see right now, of course, is that now it has again an impact onto the height, but keep in mind that this is only due to the fact that our cross axis now goes from the top to the bottom and that the items are aligned to the bottom now, so flex end. That's really important to keep in mind right here. So with that, we saw that align items always refers to the cross axis. And now the question you might ask yourselves is, okay, but what about the main axis? Now we can of course also define the position of our items along the main axis or along the main and cross axis in combination. For that, let me first maybe increase the height of our container a bit right here. Let's say we use a height of, I don't know, 500 pixels. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I think a bit more makes sense. Let's say 800 pixels right here. Yeah, I think this is fine. So if we now change the align items right here to center maybe, like that, then, as you know in the meanwhile, we have the cross axis from top to bottom. So the items are centered right here. And as you can see, they are kind of, well, starting to the left, to the beginning or at the beginning of the main axis, so right here. If I now add another property, which is called justify content, this one right here, and if I now would also apply a value of center to it, like that, and reload the page, then you can see that the items are now both centered along the cross axis because of align items, and at the same time centered along the main axis because of 𝗧𝗓𝗏. If we would now change the flex direction to column again, and therefore kind of switch the main axis and the cross axis like that, then you can see this behavior right here, because basically the space we have is not enough for our flex container. So if I increase the height a bit more, maybe let's say to 1300, something like that. Let's see. Yeah, now it's sufficient. So that's maybe better to see now. So what you can see now is basically that we now have the cross axis from left to right here, which is specified by align items. And we have the main axis now from top to bottom, which is specified by 𝗧𝗓𝗏. So if I say 𝗧𝗓𝗏 flex and right here once again, like that, and reload the page, you can see that the items now start at the end of the main axis, so from here to here. And if I would now change align items to flex start, maybe like that, and go back here and reload the page, you can see that the items are now displayed at the beginning of the cross axis, which is from left to right now, as we have flex direction column. That's important to keep in mind. And our main axis goes from top to bottom. Here we have flex end for 𝗧𝗓𝗏 right here. Now let me maybe change it back to center though, because I think this looks a bit better. And if we reload that now, looks like that. And additionally, although we played around now, I think this can still be a bit of a lot of information to keep in mind. Therefore, let's go back to the slides once again and summarize what we just learned right here. So align items, 𝗧𝗓𝗏, main axis, cross axis. Oh my god, that's a bit too much. It's actually not, because let's just summarize that in easy words now. Because what we basically did is we applied a flex direction of rho. This led to the following behavior inside our flex container right here. We basically had a main axis going from the top left corner to the top right corner. The cross axis went from the top left to the bottom left. That's what we saw and what we learned already. Now, then we added 𝗧𝗓𝗏 as a property, and we added align items as a property. In case of flex direction rho, 𝗧𝗓𝗏 simply defines this. It defines the positioning of our flex elements along the main axis. Align items simply defines the positioning along the cross axis of our elements. So in combination with 𝗧𝗓𝗏, align items, and flex direction, well, we kind of have a lot of control about our items. Then we applied flex direction column. With that, you remember the previous slide we changed basically the main axis of our flex container. Because now the cross axis takes over the place of the initial main axis, and with that, the main axis goes from the top left corner to the bottom left corner. From a 𝗧𝗓𝗏𝗏 and align items perspective, we could also say that these two switch their positions. Because align items now simply defines the positioning of the elements along the cross axis, which is now basically along the row, you could say, and 𝗧𝗓𝗏𝗏 defines the element position along the main axis, which is now the column, just to remember that. So in the end, you can actually easily memorize that by saying that 𝗧𝗓𝗏𝗏 refers to the main axis, and the main axis depends on the flex direction, and align items refers to the cross axis. That's it actually. And with that, we summarize the core concept, but still you might want to dive deeper into that. And a very good resource for that is, again, the MDN. You can find a link to this page right here attached to the video. And if you now scroll down, you can find some general information about Flexbox. But the more interesting part is this one right here. Because if you click onto align items, for example, you can find a lot of information about the different values you can apply for this align items property. Now, I will not dive into all of these values because, to be honest, I think it's important to understand the basic concept, but then you can play around with the values right here. But one interesting value I would like to show you though is this one right here, align items baseline. Because if we apply that to our project right here, so let's say we use align items baseline and we change the flex direction back to a row though, and then reload the page, then you can see something interesting. I'm not sure if it becomes totally clear, to be honest, so let me zoom in a bit maybe. Yeah, I think right here you can see it. The items are now not longer aligned right here to the top, for example, of the boxes, but they are aligned to the baseline of the actual content. Can you see it? This right here is the bottom of the X, and that's the same position that the H right here has. So that's the align items baseline declaration we can also use, for example. However, this is probably not the value we want to apply right here, so let's change it back to, well, maybe center wasn't the worst one, I think, like that. Yeah, I think this looks better. And with that, we actually almost saw all the properties we can use in combination with the Flex container. There is only one last property that I would like to show you. So time to have a look at the last property in connection with the Flex container. And this property is called align content. So basically a combination of align items and justify content. Now let's start with align content center right here. If we do that and we load our page, nothing changed. But if we now decrease the size, can you see the difference? Well, let me show you right here by going into the developer tools, and let's now unselect align content right here, like that. Can you see the difference? Align content allows us to, well, align our items along the cross axis. As for the other properties, we have different values available for align content. You can find links to that attached to this video. So this is center. With that, we center our items, but we can also add something like flex start once again, like this. And if we now reload the page, you can see that the items are positioned at the beginning of the cross axis. If I increase the size, it jumps back to this behavior because, keep in mind, we have align items and justify content center. So this is basically what we see right here. But as soon as we have our second line available right here, the align content property will come into play. We also have other values for it. For example, we have space, between this one right here. And if we apply this value, can you see what happens? The space between our elements is now simply used in a way that the elements in the first row are positioned at the beginning of our cross axis, and that the second row is positioned at the end of our cross axis. So also a nice way to display values like that differently. So that was it actually. That's the last property we have for our Flex container. Let's maybe change this back to center, for example. I think that's the better way to display our elements right here. But still, the theory is done and the theory is nice. But I think now it's time to jump back to our project and to see where we can add Flexbox right there. Because as you hopefully saw, it's a quite powerful tool actually. And just by adding these lines of code right here, these ones right here, excluding the commented out part, of course, well, we were able to change a lot of the behavior of our elements. So in the next lecture, we will go back to our project and see what we can change right there. So the theory was nice, but let's now apply Flexbox in our project. For that, I'm back on the starting page, and I would like to start with the navigation bar actually. So this part right here, which is equal on all our pages. So this means we have to go to our shared CSS file, so this one right here, and now simply replace all the display inline block code that we have. So for example, this one right here in the main header. Then we have display inline block right here in the main header brand selector. And we also got it right here in the main navigation items and so on. And we also got nice things like our width calculation right here. So all these things should be deleted now and replaced with a Flexbox solution. For that, let's have a look at the code now in the developer tools and see how we can apply it. Because always keep in mind, the structure that we want to follow is always the one that a parent element should become a Flex container. And with this Flex container, we want to be able to define the behavior of the items inside this Flex container. So let's start with the header now. This right here, our main header class. Now, inside this main header class, we basically have two elements. We have the div right here, this one, which mainly contains our hamburger button, which is not visible right now, but only in the mobile view. And we have our anchor tag, which includes our image right here. So that's the first item. The second item is our main nav class, so the navigation bar with these buttons right here. Now, wouldn't it be a good starting point to turn this main header class into a flex container, and with that, get the control of these two elements in here? I think it would. So let's go back to our code, as I said, into the shared CSS file. And let's now go to the main header right here, so this selector. Now, as I said, I want to turn this main header into a flex container. Therefore, we first have to add display flex right here, like this. If we do that and we load our page, we can see we have some change already up here. Not a perfect change yet, but we'll do it step by step. So let's see what exactly we have to improve. What we can see right here as a first improvement definitely is that we have to align our items inside of the flex container along the cross axis. You remember, we applied display flex now. This means our flex direction is row, so from left to right. Our main axis is also left to right. The cross axis therefore is top to bottom, and if we align our items along the cross axis, well, then these should be centered. Let's see if this works by adding, do you remember, align items right here. And this should be center now. Let's see if we reload the page. Yeah, this seems to work. So that was a first step now. Another thing that we could already apply is the following. If we consider the way our logo right here and these buttons are displayed, then we see that there is some space between in here. And if you look at the structure, you have one element and another one, so two flex items. And if we think back about our space between the value we used for align content in the last video, then why don't we just use not align content, but justify content now? Because remember, we want to position the elements along the main axis, which in our case is this one. So we need to use justify content. And justify content right here would simply be space between, like that. If we reload that though, we cannot see a lot of change for the moment because the code is not cleaned up yet, but let's keep that for now and see if it works the way it should work. Because normally we should have this element, then the space between, and then the other elements, which should actually follow the look of our navigation bar right here. With that, let's have a look at the CSS code and see what else we have. We have this main header div selector right here with display inline block and vertical align middle. So this basically targets the div right here, which contains the button and our logo. Now actually we don't need that anymore because this is now a flex item. So if we delete that, let's have a look and reload the page. This looks fine. Let's go to the mobile view. This also looks fine. So for the moment, we don't have a problem. This seems to work correctly. So we already got rid of that code right here, of that main header div selector, and we added flexbox right here. So that's a nice first step, as I would say. Now let's go through the code and see if we have additional display inline block declarations in here. And yes, we have. We have it right here for the main header brand selector. Let's see. This is the anchor tag, which contains the actual image in the end. Now this anchor tag, or these elements, are basically part of this div flex item now. So we should actually also be able to get rid of that code right here. Let's see. And reload the page. And now we have an issue, because now the image uses 100% of the height of the parent element basically, and this was the anchor tag. But as we removed now this display inline block declaration from it, we cannot refer to this element anymore, and therefore the 100% height is not correct anymore. But we can easily solve this by not adding the height to the anchor tag right here, but simply changing it right here for our actual image. Because if the image has now a height of 2.5 rem, and if we reload the page, we can see that it works fine now. Because now we simply say that the image height should not refer to that anchor tag, because that's not possible, but simply to the image itself, and therefore this looks alright actually. So we got again rid of some code we don't need anymore. Let's also see if this works in the mobile view. There we have a problem, but let's see. We have the toggle button, so this is this class right here, which has vertical align middle applied. So if we apply that now also to our image right here, middle, like that, and reload our page, then we can see that this is now also aligned, and yeah, I think this looks good actually. Now with that, we also cleaned that up. Let me quickly summarize what we did so far. We basically turned our main header into a flex container, and now we have these two items as flex items. And with that, we were also able to get rid of the display inline block declarations we had inside of these items, because the positioning now is controlled by the flex container. And with that, we could make our code really a lot leaner already. So let's go down and let's see where else we have display inline block. Right here, main nav item. Let's see what that is. Main nav item is, no, these are the single items we have, which are part of this unordered list right here. And if I look at this structure right now, I think we can easily improve that by also adding flex box right here. Because we know that main header is a flex container, which contains the div and this main nav class. But inside this main nav class, we could create another flex container, main nav items, the plural right here, which contains the single flex items right here. So the packages, customers, and start hosting buttons. And if we do that, we could get rid of the inline block code and again create another flex box, which would make our code again leaner and easier to maintain and more efficient basically. So how does this work? Keep in mind, main nav items should be the flex container, the item, singular, should be the single items. So we will delete the display inline block declaration from the item, so from the single list items, and now simply add display flex right here to our main nav item selector. If we do that and reload the page, we can see that this didn't crash it entirely, but we have a problem right here now. Let's find out what the problem is. Yeah, the problem is of course down here now, because we have our main nav selector right here, which is a media query, and which then defines this calculation right here and what should happen to the positioning of the entire main nav class. So that's the main nav class, and here we have our flex container. Now this should of course not happen right here, because we defined that positioning already with our previous flex boxes we created. So with that, we should actually be able to get rid of that entire code right here. Let me maybe first comment it out to see if it really works. Let's see if we reload the page. Yeah, now it disappeared. Let's see what happened right here. Yeah, we have display none right here, of course, for the mobile view. So we have to add display flex right here to our main nav. Then we would turn that into another flex container, but that's not a problem, because we basically have now this flex container, which has this flex item, which is another flex container containing these items. So that's not an issue. You can nest these different flex boxes into each other. That's not an issue and something that happens quite regularly. However, if I reload the page now, you can see a really cool thing, because now we basically got our structure back, and even better, we do not have this calculation anymore, because what we basically have right now is we have this flex container, which contains this and this flex item. For these items, we added this code right here. That's important. So we said justify content space between. Therefore, the space between that we have between these two items, can you see it? This is the second one, that's the first one. So we have a space. So this space between will be filled and both will be pushed to the left and to the right. And therefore this general structure works. And then the main nav class itself is another flex container, because with that we can make sure it is displayed. And inside this flex container, we have the main nav items flex item, which itself is another flex container and which has these 3 flex items in it. Now, I know this can be a little bit overwhelming if you use it the first time, but take your time, click through the structure in the developer tools and think about what we learned so far and how we applied it, because in the end, it's really straightforward. Because the only thing we do basically is we apply display flex and align items. And that's it basically. And with that, we were able to now easily make our code a lot leaner. And if you now look at our nav bar, this looks actually totally fine. We didn't change the look at all, but we simply made the code smaller and more efficient with Flexbox. That's really cool. But if I now look at the mobile view, because actually we work mobile first, right? And click onto this hamburger, then I don't like this look right here. Because wouldn't it be better if these 3 buttons would be, well, centered right here? I think it would. And if we look at the classes for that, we have this class right here, the mobile nav open class. Then we have an unordered list. And inside this list, we have 3 list items. Well, the structure right here is actually pretty common to us right now. And this brings us to your challenge now. Turn the mobile nav items class into a flex container and add the properties in a way that the flex items right here are displayed below each other like that, but in the center of the page. Important, if you look at the code, you need to change or add the properties right here to the mobile nav items. So this class right here should become the flex container. Additionally, have a look at the margins, because you might have to change these slightly to really change the elements inside this flex container. This is now your challenge. You can now pause the video and try to turn the mobile nav items into a flex container, and then we'll have a look at the solution together. So how did it work? Were you successful? Well, let's start now together, and the first thing we have to do, of course, is we have to add display flex right here. And we can also get rid of the text align declaration. We don't need that anymore. So with display flex being added, let's see, and we load the page. Yeah, this looks, let's say, interesting. But if we now first say that our flex direction should not be the default value, but column, because that's what we want to have right here. The buttons should be displayed below each other. Let's reload and open it. Then it looks better. Now keep in mind, we changed the flex direction to column. This means the main axis goes from top to bottom. So we need to add justify content center, right? To make sure that the elements are displayed right here. Let's see if this works fine. Yes, it does. Almost. We'll dive into the details about the almost in a few seconds. And if we now add align items to align the items along the cross axis, which is from left to right in our case, because we have flex direction column. So if we reload that and click onto the menu, this looks pretty good actually, as I would say. Now, I said you before we started the challenge that you might have to change the margins a bit. So if we inspect that now, we see that the margins are not perfect, to be honest. But we can simply change that by changing the top and bottom margin to 0, because I don't think we need it anymore. So let's see if I now reload the page, open the hamburger. Yeah, now it looks good. And we can still close it, open it. This works totally fine, actually. With that, we added Flexbox to our navigation bar, the mobile navigation bar and the desktop navigation bar. And I hope you saw already that Flexbox, well, is kind of nice to use and can help you to change the way your elements are displayed in quite an easy manner. Now, talking about easier ways to position the elements, let's also work on the footer now maybe. because the footer down here is working. That's not the question. But it's of course not using Flexbox right here. Now let's see how we can use Flexbox for this footer also in the next lecture. So time to work on the footer. For that, let's also inspect it right here to see if we can find a structure we might already know. Now this is the footer. Inside the footer we have the nav, then we have a class, and then we have an unordered list with 2 list items. Now we know this structure already, right? Because what we can do now is we can simply say that we will turn our main footer links class, so this one right here, into a flex container. And with that, we will be able to position our 2 flex items. For that, we will go back to the code and go to the main footer links class. Where is it? Here is it. To the main footer links class. So this class right here. Now, as I said, I would like to turn this class into a flex container. Therefore, we can delete again text align and now simply type display flex right here, like that. Additionally, as we see it right here, we can also delete the display block declaration from the now flex items, because, let me show you again, this will now be our flex container and these will be the flex items, so display block should not be required here anymore. Let's delete that. If we now save that and reload the page, yeah, we can see that we kind of changed something, but it doesn't work perfectly at the moment because we are in the mobile view and actually support should be displayed above terms of use. But we learned how to change this, right? Because if we now simply change the default value for the flex direction, which is row, to column, like that, and go back, like this, then we can see that the items are now positioned below each other. What we then have to do is, keep in mind, the flex direction is now column, so the main axis goes from top to bottom. This means the cross axis goes from left to right. So if we now apply align items center, we would center our items along the cross axis, and I think this would also be a good improvement now. So let's say align items center right here, like that. And let's reload the page. Yeah, now this looks better. What we can also see is that the distance between the 2 items increased because now that we applied Flexbox, you can see that the margin collapsing between these 2 items is not happening anymore, but we can easily fix that if we just decrease the margin from 1 rem to 0.5 rem, like that. Let's see, if we load the page. Yeah, now it looks the way it looked before. I think this is nicer with that closer gap between the 2 items. And with that, we actually turned this footer into a Flexbox or flex container, flex item construct. The only thing we have to change, of course, is the desktop view now, because as you can see, this simply stays the way it is before, because we have to change, well, what do we have to change actually? Well, we simply have to go down right here to our main footer link right here. So that's basically the single links again, and delete display inline block because that's not required anymore as we have flex items. With that, let's see, no change, so not what we want. But if we now scroll up again, right here to our main footer links, so the flex container, I will just copy the entire container now because that's faster to do, and add it right here. And now only keep the flex direction, but this should now be row. And important, we can keep align items, that's not the problem, but we also need justify content now, because with that, we can ensure that our items are well positioned in the center of the footer, and therefore this looks like that. So important to remember that flex direction row simply means the main axis goes from left to right and the elements are positioned along this main axis. Then we use justify content to position the elements in the center of the flex container like that. And with align items, which we have right here, center, we make sure that our elements are positioned in the center along the cross axis. And with that, we also turned our footer into a flexbox construct, as I would call it. And before we continue, let me quickly scroll through the code and see if we have to delete anything right here. Because maybe, yeah, this part right here, this commented out part, we can actually delete that. We don't need it anymore because we know flexbox works now. Let's see if we have anything else right here in our shared CSS file. No, I think this looks good actually. Yeah, and with that, we can actually continue with the next lecture. Well, we will have a look at your assignment in the Flexbox module. Did you turn the plans and the features into a Flexbox structure? Well, if it worked, congratulations. If it didn't work, let's solve it together now. Now, the first thing we have to work on is the plans section, this one right here. Specifically, we will work on the plan list class and on the different plan classes inside this plan list class. For that, let's go back to the code and let's start right here at the plans list class, this one right there. Now, the first thing we can, of course, delete, you know that in the meanwhile, is text align center. We won't need that anymore. And we can now simply add display flex to it as a first step. This should turn our class right here into a flex container. Yeah, doesn't look perfect now, but at least we didn't crash it completely. Now let's continue. We now have this flex container right here, and we of course want to make sure that our flex items are aligned to the center along the main axis, so from left to right. To do that, we can simply use justify content center. That's what we learned. So let's see what happened. Yes, it is centered, so this worked fine. And then we also want to make sure that our elements, so the flex items, are also aligned to the center along the cross axis, so from top to bottom. For that, we simply add align items right now, center like this, and let's reload it. Yeah, and as we can see, now these are aligned. Not finished yet, not perfect yet, but we'll work on it. And with that, we actually turned the plan list into a flex container. So this was step 1. Now let's work on the flex items. So this plan class right here. So basically this, and that plan. For that, we will first get rid of display inline block because we don't need it anymore as we are now using flex items. And we also don't need vertical align middle anymore because, well, why don't we need that anymore? Because we will turn these plans now into additional flex containers. Because if we now reload right here, you can see nothing changed. But we of course want to make sure that the content of these plans right here is also displayed as flex items. Therefore, each plan has to become a flex container. For that, we again add display flex right here, like that. Let's see what happens now. Yeah, doesn't look too good. But the reason for that is simply that our flex direction is wrong. We need to add a flex direction of column now, like that. With that, if we reload the page, it looks a lot better already. What we could then do is we now applied flex direction column, so the main axis goes from top to bottom. This means if we would now apply justify content space between again, this would allow us to better define the space between the different elements we have. So we can simply add justify content space between, like that. So let's see what this looks like. Doesn't make a big change, to be honest, because we have added these margins right here, but I think we can add it though because it really ensures that we follow a specific pattern when it comes to distributing the elements inside our plans. With that, we almost finished our plans right here now, but there are two things that I don't like still. The first thing is that the size of this left plan, of the free plan and of the premium plan, so the height, is still not equal. As you can see, this ends right here, this ends right there. And the second thing is that the premium plan is now ahead of our recommended plan. Let's work on the height first, and for that, add a height for all our plans. Let's maybe say 28 rem, something like that. So let's see if I now reload the page. We have an equal size for all our plans. This is just the box shadow that makes it look a bit bigger. But if we now also add a height to our highlighted plan, maybe a bit higher than, which could be 30 rem maybe, something like that. Let's see if I reload that. Yeah, this looks better. And now we have to add a Z index for the highlighted plan. Let's maybe use a Z index of, I don't know, let's say 50 maybe, so a bigger one like that. Then this looks fine. Although we have to make sure that our nav bar, yeah, that's the problem now. We have to add a larger Z index to our navigation bar, but that's not a problem. We know how this works. Let's go to the shared CSS file and right here, add a Z index of, well then, 60 maybe. That's higher than the one we applied right here, of 50. So with that, let's see. Yeah, this looks better now. So we got that. So we have turned our plan list into a flex container, which contains the plans as flex items. And then we turned the plans into separate flex containers, which contain the different elements right here. So all these elements as flex items also. We also aligned the plans right here and made sure that the recommended plan is displayed ahead of the other plans. Let's see if we crashed anything right here. No, I think this looks still really nice. And this was actually already part 1 of your assignment. The second part focused onto the features right here. Let's have a look at that in the main section, but now we have to go to the key features. Specifically, we have to go to the key feature list, and in there we have the 3 list items with the key feature class. And right now we have to do the same thing again basically. We have to turn the key feature list into a flex container, and with that the key feature class right here, all these items, into flex items. Now let's go back to the code and let's scroll down a bit. So let's first add this selector right here, and important, it should of course be part of the media query. So let's add key minus feature underscore list. That's important. I hope you saw the hint before. It should be a double underscore, so sorry for that typo right here. And with that key feature list, we can now simply say that we want to turn this into a flex container by adding display flex once again. Just to keep it in mind, we now turned this class right here into a flex container. If we now reload the page, we can see that this apparently worked, although it's not centered anymore. But let's first also delete the display inline block declaration right here for the list item and vertical align top, because I want to make sure that this is really a flexbox construct right now. Let's reload. Didn't change, but it's still not aligned. So let's align the flex items along the main axis. So we simply have to apply justify content center right here. We learned that already. So if we reload that, I think this looks all right now. As we can see right here. Yeah, this looks good. So we don't have any problems. So yeah, I think with that, we also finished the second part of your assignment. Let me now just quickly clean up the code and get rid of all the comments we have right here, because I don't think we need these anymore. So this one right here, and this one, and that one, because we added all that. I think this looks clean now. Yeah. And with that, we finished the shared CSS file. We finished the main CSS file. So let's now also make sure that the customers page, so this one right here, also is based on Flexbox now. So let's turn the customers page into a Flexbox construct. And to be honest, we actually don't have a problem right here in the mobile view. This looks totally all right. We only need Flexbox right here to make sure that the desktop view is displayed like that. For that, we simply have to focus onto the media query regarding the testimonial class and turn it into a Flex container once we are in the desktop view, and then add the properties we need to make sure that the content is displayed correctly. For that, I'm right here in the customer CSS file. And as I said, for the mobile view, there is nothing to change because we don't have display inline block or anything like that. So this is totally fine. We do have display inline block though down here in our media query. But if we now simply add display flex right here to our testimonial class, like that, let's reload the page. Doesn't look good yet, but we'll fix that in a few seconds. Then we could actually also get rid of the display and vertical align properties right here, like we did it before. So let's see what happens then. Didn't change a thing, but doesn't look good now. But if I now simply say that we want to align the items right to the center, keep in mind our cross axis goes from top to bottom. So if we now align the image and the container, this should actually work. As you can see right here, it looks good now. And what we finally can do is to get some space to the left of this image is we could again add justify content right here and use space around this time. This is a new value we didn't use so far. As I said, make sure to have a look at the MDN where you can find a lot of different values you can apply to these different properties. But if we now use space around and reload the page, you can see that now we basically easily turned this customer's page right here also into a, let's maybe get rid of that row right here. So we easily turned this customer's page also into a flexbox style. And as you can see, it still works perfectly. We have the maximum width, and when we are right here, it jumps into the mobile mode. By the way, if you wonder why the footer is outside of our window right here, this is simply due to the fact that I am zoomed in. Once I use the normal 100% zoom level, as you can see it right here, this page looks fine, the packages page looks fine, and the same thing is true for our starting page right here, which is always working as we know. However, with that, as I just said, the flex container part is finished. Now in the next lecture, we'll have a look at the flex items because we worked with the flex items as part of the flex container, but we can also specifically target the flex items and, well, change the way they are displayed. Let's find out how this works in the next lecture. So with the flex container understood and applied to our project, it's now time to dive deeper into the flex items and the corresponding properties. Specifically, we will dive into the order property, then we'll use the flex shortened, which consists of 3 single properties actually, the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis property. And finally, we'll also have a look at align self. Now, to understand these properties, we will jump back to our theory project and see what these properties do and how we can have an impact, that's really important now, onto the single flex items that we have. Because so far, all the properties applied to the flex container had the same effect onto all flex items. With the flex item specific properties, we can now really access specific items. Now let's find out how this works. For that, I'm back in our project. This is the status we had when we jumped back into our project, into the website project. So in the code, I will first change justify content to flex start like that, because I want to make sure that, well, these elements are aligned to the left, so we have a bit more space to the right. We will need that space. And then I will also delete align content because we talked about it already, and I don't think we need it anymore. As you can see, this doesn't make a difference right here. So as you saw, we have different properties which we can apply to our flex items, and that's the first important thing we have to understand. So far, we only worked in the flex container here, but this time, or in this part of the module, we will work on the single elements, so on the specific selectors right here that we want to change. Now, what can we change? Well, let's, for example, say we want to change the order of these elements. And we could say that the 4th element, so this one right here, should be positioned at the beginning, so in front of our div right here. For that, we simply have to go to item 4, the 4th element right here, and now write the order property, like that. The order property can have different values. The default value for order is simply 0. So if I apply this to our item 4, nothing changes because order 0 is applied to all elements and will not change a thing. Now, if we change order 0 to order 1 though, like that, if I now reload the page, well, you can see that the element we applied the order property to is now positioned at the end. And what does at the end mean? Well, keep in mind we have a flex direction of row, so the main axis goes from left to right, so at the end of this main axis right here. But this also means if our other elements have an order of 0 and 1 positions the element at the end of the other elements. Well, then if we would change it to -1 right here, for example, like that, and reload the page, we can position it in front of the other elements. And that's actually the core logic that we have for this order property. It allows us to change the order of the elements that the elements initially have based on the code in HTML. And by adding numbers, we simply say that the bigger number we apply to the order, the later the element will be positioned. For example, if we now apply an order value right here to our last item of -2, which is smaller than the one we applied to the fourth item right here, then this element will be positioned in front of all the other elements. On the other hand, if I now apply 1 back to our item 4 right here, like that, it will be positioned at the end of the elements because this element right here has an order value of, let me increase it a bit, of -2. So this is the smallest one. So this will be the first element that is displayed. Then we have the elements right here in the middle, this one, this one, this one, and that one, which have the default order value of 0. And then we have the last element right here with the order value of 1, so the highest value, and therefore it's positioned at the end. An important thing to keep in mind though is, if I now change our flex direction right here from row to row reverse, for example, like that, then this will of course also change the order accordingly. Now this element is displayed first on the screen because it's the last element. Remember, our main axis starts right here from right to left, so at the end of the main axis. And the element with the lowest order value, so this one right here, is positioned at the beginning of the main axis right here, but at the end of the page now if you read our page from left to right. This is also true if we change the flex direction to column right here. That's of course also possible, and if we do that, like this, and we load our page, then you can see that the element with the lowest order value is positioned first, and the element with the highest order value last. And if we now apply column reverse, then, as you can hopefully imagine now, it will be displayed like that, because this will now positioned at the end of the main axis, which now goes from the bottom left corner to the upper left corner. Now, let's change this back to row though, because I think that's the more intuitive way of displaying such elements, like that. Now, with that, we understood the first property, the order property, and we can actually remove that right here because, well, I don't think we need to change the order of our elements. It's totally fine the way it is. So let's reload that. And let me now show you the second property that we have for our flex items. Let's do that in the next lecture. So what's the next property we can use in connection with the flex items? Well, this property is close to a property we already used so far on the flex container. Now, let me show you the property. For that, I will now add it right here to our third item. So this is basically this orange box right here, this one. If we now add align, but not align content or align items, but align self, this one right here, then we can again use, well, values we already know. For example, flex start. If we do that, go back and reload the page, you can see that the element is, that's important, positioned in relation to the cross axis. So the cross axis right here, we have flex direction row. And by the way, that's also the reason why I repeat telling you the main axis and cross axis topics, because as you can see, it's really important to understand that to work with both the flex container and the flex items. However, we have flex direction row right here, so our cross axis starts in the upper left corner and goes to the lower left corner. Therefore, flex start will pin the item right here. If we would change align self to flex end, not like that, maybe written correctly like this, and reload the page again, it will be at the end. The important thing though, and the difference in contrast to align items, is that align items of course referred to all elements, that's the difference, but align self allows us to define the position of a single element which is part of a flex container, of course. As always, I will not dive into all values we have for this align self property, just because, again, I think that understanding the core concept is more important than trying out all the values. But if you have a look at the MD right here, you can see which values we can apply. We, for example, tried flex start and flex end now. We talked about baseline already when we had a look at the flex container. So feel free to play around right here, but basically this is how align self works for elements which are flex items inside our flex container. So these were the first two properties I wanted to show you. So we have order and we have align self, which always aligns a single flex item along the cross axis. And now we have 3 more properties left. Now let me show you the first property, flex grow, in the next lecture. So what is flex grow? How can we use it? Well, let's first again delete align self from our item 3 right here. And if we now look at our elements, I prepared 2 equal elements right here. The last ones with the width of 350 pixels. And as you might imagine, I had a good reason to do that. Because I will now show you flex grow with the example of these 2 items. So for that, we go back to our code, and now we will add flex grow right here. Flex grow has an initial value of 0. So if I add flex grow 0 to both our items right here, like this and like that, and go back, you can see that if I inspect the width now, we have a width of 350 pixels because we reached the maximum. And if I decrease the size, we still have wrap applied. Let me go back quickly and change our flex wrap to no wrap, because this makes it easier for me to show you the flex grow property like that. So if I now decrease the size, you know already it decreases the width up to the point where the content needs the space inside our box, which is right here at 202, let's say round about 200 pixels for both elements. Important, both elements behave the same way. That's the minimum value. And if I increase the size, as I showed you, we have a maximum value of 350 pixels. Now let's keep that in mind, and let's now go back to our code right here and scroll down to item 5. Because what if I change the value now from 0 to 1, for example? Keep in mind, the default value for flex grow is 0 for item 6, and of course also for all the other items. Now let's go back and let me first reduce the size like that, and now reload the page. Because as you can imagine, the size is still equal 316.3, 316.3. But if I now increase the width right here, like that, can you see what happens? The last item, so our item right here with flex grow 0, doesn't increase the width as soon as it hits its maximum of 350 pixels. But if I now inspect the other element, we can see that it has a width of 383 pixels now. And this is interesting, right? Because just by adding this flex grow value of 1, the element used the remaining space available, because otherwise if we would increase the width of the page, we would have space available if this would be limited to 350 pixels, and simply occupies this space because we added flex grow 1 right here. Now we added flex grow 1. What happens now if I add flex grow 2 to our last item right here, this one? Let's do that, and let's first again decrease the size, of course, and reload the page. And let's now increase the size. I think it's hard to see. Let me change it maybe to 4 even, so that's a bigger difference. So we have flex grow 1 for item 5 and flex grow 4 for item 6. So if I now reload and increase the width, I think now you can see it right here. Because the last item now became the one with the biggest width. And if we inspect the values, we can see that this item, that's not the best value. Let me increase it a bit more so that we are close to 400. This makes it easier. Yes. Now we can see that this item has a width of 400. This one has a width of 556. Now, how is this calculated? Well, basically, what happens from a mathematical perspective is the remaining space is calculated first. So if we increase the width, we would have an empty space right here, which is not occupied by elements, and this space has a certain width. Then this space will be divided by 5, because we have 1 for this element and 4 for this element. So we basically have 5 parts how this remaining total space should be divided. Well, and 1 part of this remaining space, so 1/5 of it, will be applied to our first element right here, so around about 50 pixels. And then we have the remaining 4/5, so around about 200 pixels, which will be added to that last item. So what we basically saw right here is, by increasing the width of our page, we had a remaining space of 250 pixels that must be distributed between these two flex grow items right here. As we have flex grow 1 for this item, 1/5 is applied to this item, and 4/5 are applied to this last item. So that's how it works. If I now would add flex grow 1 to this element right here also, like that, and if I reload the page again, then you can see that both elements now have a width of round about 400 and let's say 25 pixels, because this simply means, again, we have a free space of 250 pixels, which will then be split into 2 parts, one right here and one right there, and then equally distributed. If I change it to 2 right here, as a last example, and reload the page, you can see that we have 85 right here, and we have 170 right there. It's not totally matching because it's not exactly 250 pixels, but again, 1/3 is added right here, and 2/3 are added to this item right here. One last thing about flex grow though, if I would change the flex wrap again to wrap right here, like that, and go back and reload our page, then nothing happens right here. But if I decrease the size, we can see that as soon as we hit the defined width of 350 pixels, the element will be wrapped into the second line. And interestingly, this element then occupies the entire space of this second line. Now, why is this happening? Well, if this element would only have 350 pixels, there would be an empty space. And this empty space will again be filled, but as we only have one element now with a flex grow of 2 applied, doesn't make a difference though. If I apply 5 right here, for example, it will remain the same because the space can only be distributed to one element. Therefore, as soon as you apply a flex grow which is larger than 0, a single element which will be wrapped into the second line will occupy the entire space, as we can see it right here. So this was the last thing about flex grow, and let me change flex wrap back to no wrap, not bow, no wrap right here. And let's also delete flex grow right here and right there, because we don't need it at the moment. Right here, like that, because our page looks fine like this. And with that, we can jump to the next property, because if we have flex grow, well, chances are that we also have flex shrink. So what is flex shrink? Well, as you can imagine, it defines the behavior our elements have once we, well, decrease the width. Now keep in mind that the current default behavior is this one, that we basically shrink the elements up to the point where the content requires the space. At least this is true when we apply the flex wrap with no wrap right here, which we will keep like that. Now let's add flex shrink to our item 5 and item 6 again. Flex shrink, like that. And the default value for flex shrink is 1. Let's also add this right here to our item 6, like that. If we now reload the page, you can see the behavior is exactly the one we had before. Now, if I change flex shrink right here to 0, for example, for our last item, then you can see that now the element cannot shrink anymore. So as you can see, it only shrinks up to the 350 pixels width we defined, but as soon as it hits this value, it cannot decrease its width, as you can see it right here and right there. So that's the first thing. If we add flex shrink to our item right here, this item will not become smaller than the defined width it has. So this is flex shrink 0. What happens now if we add flex shrink with a value of 1 to our item 5 right here, and let's say a flex shrink value of 4 to our 6th item? Well, let's see. If we reload the page, you can see nothing changes right here. So here, that's the width of 350 for both items. But if I now decrease the width, it's hard to see, but if we inspect it, let's maybe decrease it a bit more to around about 340. A little bit to go. One more time. Yeah, like that. Now we can see that from the initial width of 350 pixels for item 5, we now have 340 pixels left. So 10 pixels less than the initial value. But our last item already decreased by around about 40 pixels. So 4 times the value we had for our 5th item, because we have flex shrink of 1 right here and 4 right there. And that's exactly how flex shrink works. It allows you first to specify if an element is allowed to shrink. As we saw with the default value of 1, all elements can indeed shrink. With a value of 0, you can ensure that this is not possible. And if you add a flex shrink value which is different from 0, it first allows us to, well, allow our elements to shrink. But if you apply a bigger shrink value to different elements, then this will also define how much more one element is allowed to shrink when comparing it to another element. And that's actually what you can do with flex shrink. With that, we only have one property left right now. So what's the last property that we can use for our flex items? Well, as before, let's first get rid of our flex shrink right here and right there. And let me then add this property. And the name of this property is flex basis, this one right here. Now, what is the flex basis? The flex basis simply defines the size of an element, and now it's really important, depending on the main axis. So flex basis is not the width or the height. It can basically be both, which is simply dependent on the flex direction. And let me say that one more time. That's the reason why understanding the concept of main and cross axis and how it is changed is really crucial right here. However, at the moment we have a flex direction of rho. So the main axis goes from left to right. We also have defined a width. Now with that, if I now add a value of, let's say, 200 pixels to our 5th item right here, well, then if the flex basis refers to the main axis and defines the size of our element dependent on the main axis, well then, if we reload the page, we should see that our element has a width of 296.94 pixels. That's not equal to 300. But keep in mind what we learned in the last lecture. We learned that the default value for flex shrink is 1. And this basically allows our element to shrink in here. Therefore, as we now are in a view which is, well, kind of smaller than the initial one, as you can see it right here, we don't have these 300 pixels. If I now increase the size, you can see we have the 300, or if we go back right here and add back flex shrink of 0 and maybe do the same thing for the last item again, because I think it makes things a bit clearer now, like that. Then we can see if we reload the page, no matter what we do right here, we will have 350 pixels for our last item, and 300 pixels as defined by the flex basis for the fifth item. So that's what happens right here. If we define a flex basis and our flex direction is set to row, the flex basis will override this default width property. If we use the default value for flex basis, which would be auto, this one right here, it will simply apply the width right here, as we can see. Like that, it's 350 pixels because, well, flex basis, as I said, will fall back to the width value right here. The problem is that while I'm saying it will fall back to the width value, this is only correct because the main axis is now from left to right and therefore equal to the width. Now let's have a look what happens if we change the flex direction to column. And with that, we change our main axis, of course, which is now from top to bottom. So if we save that, keep in mind we have a width defined but no height defined and the flex basis is auto. So if we go back and reload the page, you can see that element 5, this one right here, has of course the width applied of 350 pixels as defined, and the width is just as high as we needed for the content to be displayed. But this means that if I now add a height right here, like that, let's say of 200 pixels, like that, and reload the page, then you can see that our fifth item now exactly has this height, because flex basis is set to auto. So the flex basis will fall back to the default value set for the main axis. That's important. If the main axis goes from left to right, this will be the width right here. If the main axis goes from top to bottom, then this will be the height. At the same time, this also means that if we define a value for the flex basis, let's say of 300 pixels now, like that, this value will be applied because the fallback only comes into play if we set flex basis to auto. If we define the flex basis, it will override, as we can see right here, either the height, if the main axis goes from top to bottom, or the width, if the main axis goes from left to right, or right to left, of course. And that's actually the basic concept of flex basis. Let's now maybe change the flex direction back to row, because that's what I prefer, to be honest. And I think we can keep flex basis like that. That's really fine. As you can see, the width now is again 300 pixels and the height is 200, which we can actually also delete. I think this looks nicer. Yes, like that. Some other important things about flex basis, we can also use values like percentages, for example. Let's say we use 10% right here. If I now reload the page, we can see that we have a width of 201 pixels, but that's just the minimum value we need for the width to display the content. But if I increase the size up to here, as you can see, now the width increases. So we have 206.19 pixels now as a width for our element. And if we inspect the flex container right here, sorry, it's not really good to see. And if we scroll down now right here to the bottom, we can see we have a width of the content. That's important. So the content of the flex container has 2062 pixels. And again, our width is 10% of that. So 206.2, that's just some rounding, pixels of a width. So that's also what you can apply to the flex basis. So using percentage values for the flex basis is also possible. Now let me summarize what we learned about the flex basis now. The important thing is that the flex basis always refers to the main axis. If flex basis is set to auto, the fallback will either be the width if the main axis goes from left to right or right to left, or the fallback will be the height in case the main axis goes from top to bottom or bottom to top. That's the first thing that we have to keep in mind. The second thing we have to keep in mind is that the flex basis property and all these properties we saw right here can only be applied to flex items. Therefore, we need a parent element, which is a flex container, and which has the display flex or inline flex value applied. These are the two things that we should keep in mind when working with flex basis and with the flex items specifically. And the last important information is that we also have a shorthand for the properties we just talked about. because instead of writing flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, we could simply say that we write flex like that, and then the default value for flex grow would be 0. The default for flex shrink is 1, and the default for flex basis is auto, as we learned it. With that, if we go back and reload the page, we can see if we delete flex shrink right here, by the way, like that, as we can see now, we basically have our default behavior back that we had when we started this second part of this module. And we also saw that we can use the properties separately or combine them in this shorthand right here. The only problem we have right now, though, is that, well, in our project, we actually do not have to use the flex items because our project works perfectly the way it is. Therefore, showing you this flex items logic in theory was really important because there might be situations where you have to use these flex items. But from a project perspective, we are actually done with the flexbox part, and therefore we are also done with this module. So let me summarize what we learned in the next lecture. So what have we learned about flexbox and about how to use it? Well, generally, we learned that with Flexbox, we can easily change the way our elements are displayed on a website. Specifically, Flexbox includes the Flex container, so this parent element, and the items inside this container, the so-called Flex items. Then we were diving deeper into that and had a look at the Flex container, which was created by adding the display Flex, or inline Flex, that's also possible, declaration to an element. And this element will then be turned into such a Flex container. Now, regarding the properties we can apply to such a Flex container, we of course have the display Flex or inline Flex property. We also had Flex direction, which basically defined the way our elements are displayed. So remember, we had row, row reverse, column, and column reverse. We also saw that we can define how the elements should wrap. So with wrap and no wrap for the Flex wrap property, we could change that behavior. And the shorthand for these two properties was flex flow. So the first value for the flex flow is the flex direction. The second value is the flex wrap. We then had different properties which allowed us to change the behavior of all the flex items inside our flex container. With align items, we could, well, align our items in relation to the cross axis. Justify content allowed us to do the same thing along the main axis. With align content, we were allowed to define the behavior along the cross axis again, that's important, in case our elements are wrapped over 2 or more lines. When talking about these properties, we of course also had a look at the main axis versus the cross axis. We learned that flex direction basically defines the main axis, so if this is the row or the column, and the properties we applied to our flex container also dependent on the main axis and the cross axis we had, which therefore also meant that the behavior of the flex items that is coming with the properties we used is also highly dependent on the flex direction property. We then also had a look at the flex items, because in contrast to the properties we added to the flex container, which affected all flex items, the flex item specific properties allowed us to change the behavior of individual flex items. Therefore, we also had a look at the different properties related to the flex items. We talked about order, which allows us to, well, as the name says, change the order of the flex items along the cross or main axis. We talked about align self, which is kind of like align items, so which allows us to position an element in relation to the cross axis, but this time for a specific flex item, for an individual flex item. And then we talked about flex, so the flex shorthand, which combines flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And that's actually it. This is actually all the core knowledge that we have now to work with Flexbox, and as we saw it in our project, to make our project a bit more leaner and easier to use and maintain. So this is the end of this module, and with that, I will now hand over to Max again, who will show you another, maybe more advanced concept of changing the way our elements behave and are displayed, the CSS grid. So let's find out what that is, how it works, and especially how we can apply it to our project in the next module.